Outlaws threat a 93-year-old woman's farm. Then her Navy SEAL grandson shows up and changes everything. Rose Miller's weathered hands moved methodically across the wooden tabletop, polishing the surface with beeswax and lemon oil. At 93, her fingers bore the hallmarks of a life spent nurturing the land, calluses from decades of farm work, blue veins that mapped rivers of determination beneath paper-thin skin. The Miller farmhouse had stood in Whispering Pines, Montana, for over a century, weathering dust storms, economic collapses, and the relentless march of time. Outside, the September wind whistled through the aspens, their golden leaves trembling like coins in sunlight. Rose paused, listening. The sound of approaching vehicles drew her attention, not the familiar rumble of her neighbors' trucks, but something heavier, more deliberate. She made her way to the kitchen window, her cane tapping a rhythm on the pine floorboards her husband Thomas had laid with his own hands 60 years ago. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled up her long driveway, kicking up dust that swirled like ghosts in their wake. Rose's breath caught in her throat. This was the 3rd time this month they'd come. The Steel Riders, that's what folks in town called them, a gang that had infiltrated Whispering Pines like a slow-growing cancer. Some said they were mere land developers with aggressive tactics. Others whispered darker truths about drugs and human trafficking. All Rose knew was they wanted her land, specifically the northern section that bordered Canada, 200 acres of dense forest and hidden meadows that had been in the Miller family for generations. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, Maxwell Reed, with his silver hair and practiced smile. Behind him, 4 men in leather jackets lingered, their presence a silently delivered threat. "Mrs. Miller," Reed called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Beautiful day for a chat, isn't it?" Rose didn't answer. She reached for the phone instead, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed a number she knew by heart. "Jack, it's Grandma. I think it's time you came home." Commander Jack Miller felt the desert heat of Bahrain press against him as he stepped away from the training facility. His unit had just completed a 3-month deployment, with another scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. At 38, he'd given the Navy SEALs 16 years of his life, accumulating scars both visible and hidden. His weathered face had seen sunrises over the Hindu Kush and sunsets across the Persian Gulf. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the tremor in his grandmother's voice. Within hours, he'd secured emergency family leave and was on a transport plane bound for the States. As Montana's rugged landscape appeared beneath him 2 days later, memories flooded back. Summers spent helping his grandfather repair fences, learning to track elk, falling asleep to his grandmother's stories about the land and its history. The sheriff's department cruiser waiting at the small regional airport told him everything he needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. Sheriff Linda Cooper, a childhood friend with whom he'd once stolen apples from Old Man Henderson's orchard, stood leaning against the vehicle, her face grave. "Welcome home, Jack," she said, extending her hand. "Wish it were under better circumstances." He nodded, tossing his duffel bag into the back of the cruiser. "Fill me in." As they drove through the familiar landscape, Linda explained. The Steel Riders had appeared in Whispering Pines about a year ago, buying up properties, establishing businesses. Their leader, Maxwell Reed, presented himself as a legitimate businessman, but something wasn't right. Properties were changing hands under suspicious circumstances. People who opposed them suffered accidents or suddenly decided to move away. And now they were after Rose's land. "We're a small department, Jack," Linda said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. 3 deputies and me. We've documented the threats, filed reports, but we're outgunned and outmanned. The county prosecutor seems reluctant to pursue anything, and the state police are stretched thin. Jack watched the landscape scroll by, the familiar mountains standing sentinel over valleys now dotted with new construction. "What about federal involvement?" "I've made inquiries, but without concrete evidence of interstate crime, They're not interested. They pulled up to the farmhouse, and Jack felt a lump form in his throat. The old place looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he remembered. The barn needed painting, and the fence along the eastern pasture was sagging. He'd been away too long. Rose stood on the porch, her small frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. She'd grown thinner, frailer, but her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had guided him through childhood after his parents' death. "Look at you," she said as he embraced her carefully. "Still as handsome as your grandfather." His throat tightened. "I'm sorry I've been away so long, Grandma." She patted his cheek, her touch light as a butterfly's wing. "You're here now, that's what matters." Over dinner, a pot roast Rose had prepared despite Jack's protests that she shouldn't go to the trouble. She explained the situation. The first visit from Reed had been cordial enough, an offer to buy her land at what seemed a generous price. When she refused, the offers became more insistent, then threatening. "Last week," Rose said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, "they cut my fence line. 30 head of cattle wandered off. Sheriff Cooper found them 2 miles away, but by then, 2 had died from drinking contaminated water from the old mine runoff." Jack felt a cold rage build inside him. "And yesterday, they came again. Said accidents happen to stubborn old women who don't know what's good for them. Said I should ask Elmer Prescott what happens to people who don't cooperate." Linda interjected. "Elmer's place burned down 2 months ago, officially ruled accidental, but he'd refused to sell to Reed," Jack finished, understanding. Rose reached across the table, her hand finding his. "I won't sell, Jack. This land isn't just property, it's our history, our legacy. Your grandfather is buried on that North Ridge. So are your parents, so will I be someday." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "Not for a long time yet, Grandma, and not because of these people." That night after Rose had gone to bed, Jack and Linda sat on the porch, speaking in low voices. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to one another. "What do you know about Reed?" Jack asked. Linda sighed. "Not much. Appeared about 14 months ago. Started buying up properties, especially those with remote access to the Canadian border. Background checks come back clean, but that just means he's good at covering his tracks." Jack nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "I need to understand their operation, what they're really after." "You're thinking about going undercover?" Linda asked, alarmed. "Jack, these aren't amateurs, they're dangerous." "So am I," he replied quietly, "and I've infiltrated worse." The next week passed in a blur of activity. Jack reconnected with old friends, quietly gathering information. To the outside world, he was just a military man on leave, helping his elderly grandmother with the farm. But beneath this facade, he was systematically mapping the Steel Riders organization, identifying key players and locating their operations. He installed security cameras around Rose's property, reinforced doors and windows, and taught her how to use the new security system. At night, he patrolled the perimeter, his training allowing him to move like a ghost through the familiar landscape. On the 10th day, he made his move. Dressed in worn jeans and a leather jacket, he walked into the Broken Spoke, a bar on the edge of town that had become the Steel Riders' unofficial headquarters. "Heard you boys might be hearing," he said to the bartender, a burly man with a scar running down one cheek. "I've got skills that might be useful." The bartender eyed him suspiciously. "What kind of skills?" "The kind that got me discharged from the army," Jack lied smoothly, having carefully constructed his cover story. "The kind that makes me good at moving things across borders without attracting attention." Within an hour, he was sitting across from Maxwell Reed himself, in a back room that smelled of cigarettes and expensive cologne. "Miller," Reed said, studying a tablet. "Any relation to the old woman out on Route 7? Jack had anticipated this question. Distant cousin, maybe, Don't know, don't care. I'm just looking for work that pays better than the logging company. Reed's eyes narrowed, but he seemed to accept the explanation. We might have something for you, trial basis, see how you work out. For the next 2 weeks, Jack worked his way into the organization, starting with simple tasks, driving shipments, acting as muscle during business meetings. Each night, he returned to Rose's farm, sharing information with Linda, who was quietly building a case. They discovered that the Steel Riders were indeed part of a larger operation, using the remote properties they'd acquired to move drugs and people across the Canadian border. The northern section of Rose's land, with its dense forest and hidden valleys, was the missing piece they needed to complete a route that would be nearly impossible for Border Patrol to monitor. Rose, for her part, showed a resilience that amazed even Jack. She refused to leave her home despite the danger, insisting that running away would only embolden the criminals. Instead, she kept up her normal routines, baking pies, tending her garden, and greeting neighbors with the same warmth she'd always shown. "Your grandmother is the bravest woman I know," Linda told Jack one evening as they reviewed the evidence they'd gathered. Jack nodded, pride mixing with worry. "She's also the most stubborn. Gets it from her Scottish ancestors, she always says." The breakthrough came when Jack overheard a conversation between Reed and a man he called the Collector, a tall, thin individual with a British accent who seemed to outrank even Reed. They discussed a shipment coming through in 3 days, a special delivery that would please the Foundation. "This is bigger than we thought," Jack told Linda that night. "There's something called the Foundation behind all this. I think the Steel Riders are just the local franchise of a much larger operation." Linda's face paled. "That matches some intel I received from a federal contact. They've been tracking a shadow organization across multiple states, but can never quite pin it down." "We need to move on this shipment," Jack said. "It's our best chance to gather concrete evidence and force federal intervention." The plan was set. Linda would coordinate with trusted state police officers to be in position when the shipment arrived. Jack, still undercover, would ensure the transport took the route they anticipated. Rose would stay with Linda's sister in town, safely away from any potential conflict. Except Rose had other ideas. "This is my home," she said firmly when Jack tried to convince her to leave. "I've lived here for 70 years. I'm not leaving now." "Grandma, please," Jack pleaded. "It's too dangerous." Rose's eyes flashed with the same determination he'd seen so many times in his youth. "I survived the blizzard of '59 that took your grandfather's brother. I survived the wildfires of '78 that nearly took this house. I survived losing your grandfather and then your parents. I will survive this too." In the end, they compromised. Rose would stay, but Jack installed a panic room in the cellar, reinforced with steel and stocked with supplies. At the first sign of trouble, she would lock herself inside. The night of the shipment arrived, dark and moonless. Jack, now trusted enough to be part of the security detail, rode in the lead vehicle. The convoy, 3 trucks and 2 SUVs, moved along remote logging roads, eventually turning onto a narrow track that led toward the Canadian border through Rose's property. What the Steel Riders didn't know was that every inch of that route was now monitored by cameras Linda and Jack had installed. State police officers were positioned at strategic points, with federal agents finally brought in after seeing the evidence Jack and Linda had accumulated. As the convoy approached the critical juncture, a narrow bridge over Whispering Creek, Jack gave the signal. Lights blazed from the trees, and the sound of helicopters filled the air. The operation was textbook perfect, with officers swarming the vehicles before the criminals could react. All except for Reed, who somehow slipped away in the confusion, and Jack knew exactly where he was headed. Rose heard the vehicles approaching long before she saw them. She'd been sitting in her rocking chair by the window, a shotgun across her lap, Not that she intended to use it, but the weight of it was comforting. When the black SUV skidded to a halt in her yard, she wasn't surprised to see Maxwell Reed step out, his usually immaculate appearance now disheveled, his face twisted with rage. "You," he spat as he strode toward the house. "You and your Seal grandson think you've won. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Rose stood slowly, her hands steady on her cane. Through the window, she could see Reed pull a pistol from his jacket. She shuffled toward the cellar door, her heart pounding but her mind clear. Jack had made her practice this drill a dozen times: get to the panic room, lock the door, press the alarm. She was halfway across the kitchen when the front door burst open. Reed stood there, gun raised, hair wild, eyes burning with hatred. "The Foundation doesn't lose, old woman," he snarled. "Ever." Rose straightened her spine, looking him directly in the eye. "Young man, I've faced down bigger threats than you in my day." For a moment, confusion flickered across Reed's face. Then from behind him, a shadow moved. Jack, having anticipated Reed's escape route, had doubled back to the farm. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Reed, forcing him to his knees. "It's over," Jack said, his voice cold. "The Foundation is being exposed as we speak. Your operation is finished." Reed laughed, a hollow sound. "You think you can stop something that's been in motion for decades? We have people everywhere, judges, politicians, law enforcement. This changes nothing." "You're wrong," came a new voice. Linda stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 FBI agents. "We've been building this case for months. Your encrypted communications, your financial records, your connections to officials in 3 states. It's all coming out." As they led Reed away, Rose sank into a kitchen chair, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush. Jack knelt beside her, his strong hands gently holding hers. "You should have gone to the panic room," he chided softly. Rose smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I knew you'd come. You always do when it matters." Later that night, as news of the operation spread through Whispering Pines, neighbors began appearing at Rose's farm. They brought food, offers of help to repair the damage done by the Steel Riders over the past months, and stories of their own encounters with the gang. What had begun as one woman's stand against intimidation had revealed a community's strength. 6 months later, the full scope of the Foundation was still being uncovered, a network of criminal enterprises spanning multiple countries, with tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses and government offices. The Steel Riders had been merely one arm of a much larger beast. Jack extended his leave, helping Rose restore the farm to its former glory. The north pasture, once threatened by development, now flourished with new growth. The fence lines were repaired, stronger than before. And in the farmhouse kitchen, Rose taught Jack how to make her famous apple pie, passing down the recipe that had been in the family for generations. "I won't be here forever," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "But this land will be, and now it has a new story to tell." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of her words. A story about not backing down, even when the odds seem impossible. Rose smiled, her weathered face illuminated by the fading light. "About family," she corrected gently. "About coming home when it matters most." In the distance, a lone coyote called out, its voice carrying across the valley. The sound hung in the air, wild, free, and unafraid, much like the spirit of the woman who had stood her ground against forces that would have overwhelmed most. And in that moment, Jack knew that whatever battles lay ahead, this land, and the fierce, gentle woman who had protected it, would endure. Spring arrived in Whispering Pines with a symphony of renewal. Wild lupins dotted the meadows with purple splashes, and the aspens unfurled tender green leaves that whispered secrets in the Montana breeze. 1 year had passed since the Steel Riders operation had been dismantled, leaving behind both scars and unexpected blessings. Rose sat in her garden, her weathered hands gently pressing heirloom tomato seedlings into the dark soil. At 94, each planting was an act of faith, a testament to her belief in tomorrow. Nearby, Jack worked on reinforcing the garden fence, the rhythmic sound of his hammer punctuating the morning quiet. "You know," Rose said, patting the earth around a delicate seedling, "this garden's seen 9 decades of millers putting down roots. Your great-grandfather cleared this plot by hand in 1920. Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He'd resigned his commission 3 months ago, a decision that had surprised his commanding officers but felt inevitable to him. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, Grandma, about roots." Rose smiled, understanding in her pale blue eyes. She'd never pushed or questioned when Jack announced his decision to retire from the SEALs, but she'd recognized something in his face. A weariness, yes, but also a hunger for something the military could no longer provide. The investigation into the Foundation had expanded far beyond Montana's borders. What had begun as a land grab in a small town had unraveled a web of corruption spanning 3 countries. Federal prosecutors had built cases against judges, border officials, and even 2 state senators. Maxwell Reed had eventually agreed to testify against his superiors in exchange for a reduced sentence, though the shadowy figures at the very top of the organization remained elusive. The town of Whispering Pines had changed too. The exposure of the criminal network had sparked a renaissance of sorts. Properties that had been acquired under duress were returned to their rightful owners. New businesses opened, owned by locals rather than shell companies. The community had discovered its strength, like a muscle that grows more powerful after healing from injury. Perhaps the most profound change had occurred in the relationship between Jack and Rose. What had begun as a grandson rushing home to protect his grandmother had evolved into a partnership of equals. Jack had brought his tactical expertise and physical strength. Rose had contributed her unwavering moral compass and deep knowledge of the land and its people. Together, they had accomplished what neither could have done alone. "Sheriff Cooper stopping by later," Jack mentioned, returning to his task. "Says she has some news about the northern property line." Rose nodded, her experienced fingers continuing their work with the seedlings. Linda Cooper had gone from small-town sheriff to something of a national figure after the case broke. She'd been featured in news stories about rural law enforcement standing up against organized crime, and there were whispers about a possible run for state office. "She's done good work," Rose said simply. "Always knew she would, even when she was just a gangly girl stealing my raspberry pies from the windowsill." Jack laughed, remembering his own childhood escapades with Linda. "We were terrible kids." "You were spirited," Rose corrected, her voice warm with memory. "There's a difference." By mid-afternoon, Linda's cruiser rolled up the driveway. She stepped out in her uniform, still as crisp and professional as ever, but there was a new confidence in her bearing, a sense of earned authority. Over coffee at Rose's kitchen table, the same table where Jack had planned the operation against the Steel Riders, Linda shared her news. The federal government was establishing a new border protection initiative, focusing on community partnerships rather than just technology and barriers. They wanted to use part of the millers' northern property as a training ground for a pilot program. "They'd lease it, not buy it," Linda explained, passing a folder of documents across the table. "The land would remain in your family. They're interested specifically because of its unique features and its history now, how it became a symbol of resistance." Rose's fingers traced the embossed federal seal on the folder, her expression thoughtful. What exactly would they be training for? "Search and rescue primarily, environmental monitoring, community liaison work." Linda leaned forward. "Not a militarized presence, Rose, something different, something more aligned with what this town stood for during the crisis." Jack watched his grandmother carefully. He knew how she felt about government agencies, her natural Montana suspicion of distant bureaucracies making decisions about local lands. But he also saw her weighing the possibilities, the chance to transform what had nearly been a corridor for suffering into a passage for help. "I'll think on it," Rose said finally. "Jack and I will discuss it." After Linda left, they walked the northern property line together. Though the day was warm, Rose insisted on making the journey, leaning on her cane but setting a steady pace. Jack matched his steps to hers, nodding how she paused occasionally to point out landmarks, a lightning-struck pine that had survived despite its scars, a hidden spring that never ran dry even in drought years. "Your grandfather proposed to me right there," Rose said, indicating a clearing where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. "Said he didn't have much to offer except this land and his promise to tend it well." Jack smiled. "Seems like he delivered on that promise." Rose nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "He did, and when we lost your parents," her voice caught slightly, "even after all these years, this land held us together, gave us purpose when grief might have broken us." They continued walking, reaching the ridge where 3 generations of Millers were buried in the small family plot. Rose stood before the markers, her slight frame unbowed by age or circumstance. "I've been thinking," she said at last, "about what happens next, about legacy." Jack remained silent, sensing she had more to say. "The Foundation wanted this land because it connects things, countries, people, past and future. They saw it as a route for their poison." She turned to face him, her eyes sharp and clear. "But connections can be used for healing too, can't they?" Jack nodded, understanding dawning. "The training program." "Not just that," Rose said, "though I'm inclined to agree to it. But I've been watching you these past months, Jack. The way you've reconnected with this place, with the community. The way you've helped others rebuild after the Steel Riders left." She reached up to place her hand against his cheek, a gesture she'd been making since he was a small boy coming to her with scraped knees and childhood hurts. "You've found your purpose here. I see it in you. The land speaking to you, just like it always spoke to your grandfather." Jack felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but recognition. He'd spent 16 years of his life defending his country in distant places, navigating foreign terrain with tactical precision. Yet it had taken coming home to fully understand what he'd been fighting for. "I've been offered a position," he admitted, "with the new border program, senior advisor on community integration. They want someone who understands both security concerns and local perspectives." Rose's smile was knowing. "Of course they do. You've always stood in thresholds, Jack, between military and civilian life, between the outside world and this place." She gestured to the vast landscape surrounding them. "Some people are bridges, that's their calling." As they made their way back to the farmhouse, the setting sun painted long shadows across the fields. They walked in comfortable silence, 2 generations united by blood and choice, by crisis overcome and future embraced. That evening, neighbors began arriving for what had become a monthly tradition, a community dinner at the Miller farm. What had started as an impromptu gathering during the height of the crisis had evolved into something permanent, a ritual of connection and resilience. Jack watched from the porch as trucks and cars filled the yard. People stepped out bearing covered dishes and folding chairs, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of shared experience. Children darted between adults, playing games in the lengthening shadows. Rose appeared beside him, dressed in her best blouse, a touch of lipstick brightening her face. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" she said softly. Jack nodded. The same people who had once lived in fear of the Steel Riders now moved with confidence, their laughter carrying across the yard. Among them were new faces, too, families who had moved to Whispering Pines in the past year, drawn by stories of a community that had stood together against intimidation. "You know what I think," Rose said, her voice taking on the thoughtful tone that always preceded her most profound observations. "I think sometimes it takes an outsider to show a community who they truly are. Those Steel Riders came to divide us, to make us feel small and helpless. Instead, They reminded us of our strength. As dinner was served at long tables set up beneath strands of lights, Jack found himself seated beside Linda Cooper. The conversation flowed around them, talks of the approaching summer, plans for the town's first post-crisis festival, debates about the best fishing spots in the county. "It's really something, isn't it?" Linda said quietly. "A year ago, half these folks were afraid to speak to their neighbors, worried about who might be reporting back to Reed." Jack nodded, watching as Rose moved among the guests, a diminutive queen holding court. Despite her age, she seemed more vibrant than ever, her laugh carrying across the gathering. "She's the heart of this place," he said, "always has been." "And you," Linda asked, "have you decided about the advisory position?" Jack's gaze swept across the assembled community, the ranchers and teachers, the store owners and retirees who had transformed from victims to victors. "I have," he said. "I'm staying. This is where I'm needed now." As the evening deepened into night, someone brought out a fiddle, and impromptu dancing began on the stretch of yard between the house and barn. Rose declined several invitations to join, claiming her dancing days were behind her, until a slow waltz began. Then, to everyone's surprise, she rose and extended her hand to Jack. "My grandson owes me a dance, I believe," she announced. Jack led her carefully to the makeshift dance floor, supporting her with a gentle hand at her waist. He'd faced combat situations with less trepidation than he felt now, terrified of causing her to stumble. But Rose Miller had never been as fragile as she appeared. As they began to move to the music, she straightened her spine and found her rhythm, her steps small but sure. "I danced with your grandfather in this very spot on our 50th anniversary," she told him, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "And with your father at his high school graduation party. Now you. 3 generations of Miller men, all good dancers." Jack laughed softly. "I think you're being generous about my skills, Grandma." "Nonsense," she replied. "You've got Miller blood. We've always known how to find our way, even when the music changes." As they danced under the Montana sky, Jack felt something settle within him. A certainty, a homecoming more profound than his physical return had been. The Navy had taught him how to face external threats, how to protect and defend. But it was here, on this land with this remarkable woman, that he had learned the deeper meaning of strength. Later, as the guests departed and the night grew quiet, Jack and Rose sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass like earthbound stars. The future stretched before them, not without challenges, but rich with possibility. The foundation's shadow had receded, allowing new light to fall on whispering pines. "You know," Rose said, her voice soft with approaching sleep, "your grandfather used to say that land doesn't really belong to people. People belong to the land if they're wise enough to listen to what it needs." Jack nodded, understanding at last. He had traveled the world, only to discover his purpose waiting for him at home. Not in dramatic operations or secret missions, but in the quiet, essential work of building community, of standing as a bridge between worlds, of continuing what Rose had begun. "I'm listening, Grandma," he said, taking her hand in his. "I hear it now." And as night deepened around the old farmhouse, its foundations solid despite all attempts to uproot it, 2 guardians, one at the beginning of her journey, one finding his way into his own, sat together in peaceful silence, their legacy secure in the land they had fought to protect and in the community that had become their extended family. Not all victories came with medals or recognition. Some were measured in small moments of connection, in gardens planted for future harvests, in communities discovering their collective strength. Some battles were won not with weapons, but with unwavering principle and the courage to stand one's ground. In the end, that was the story of Whispering Pines, not just of outlaws and heroes, but of ordinary people who, when tested, had found extraordinary reserves of courage within themselves. And at the heart of it all, A 94-year-old woman who had never forgotten what was worth fighting for, and a grandson who had traveled around the world only to find his true mission waiting for him at home.